Another thing that's come up recently has been with these different strikes that have been happening in San Francisco. So there are two pretty important ones, one that's already started, one that looks like it's about to start. Um, but just to frame this, we've seen within the past year there's been numerous cuts to different part of San Francisco's infrastructure and social safety net. San Francisco Muni has been facing a $307 million deficit, which could grow in the coming years, and that could result in a quarter of the agency's service being cut unless there's a public bailout or more funding allocated. We've seen cuts to Medicaid nationwide that could leave many people in the city in dire straits. Lurie's family zoning plan that could, if left unchecked, it would likely lead to another really devastating wave of gentrification against not just San Francisco, but the Bay Area's working class. When gentrification hits hard in one particular city, it affects the whole metropolitan area and the dynamics of it. It's not just isolated to cities or neighborhoods. And despite Denim Dan's talk about affordability during the State of the City address a few weeks ago, he's still more interested in courting billionaires and corporations than actually taxing them. He's actually come out against this, proposal for a statewide tax on billionaires. It's got a lot of people's feathers ruffled and threatening to leave the city, although we see how often this type of rhetoric comes up whenever anything like this happens, and how many of them are just bluffing. However, in a more positive note, we've seen this past week 31,000 healthcare workers in Hawaii and California go on strike against Kaiser Permanente. So this is the second time they've been on strike since October, and they've opted to go back to the picket line after negotiations broke down in December. So Kaiser has been attempting to intimidate workers into not striking by spreading misinformation and, pushing forth this idea about like penalties for going on strike. This is, pretty clear cut, just like anti-union, anti-strike propaganda that a lot of employers put forward. And so some of their demands are, the Kaiser union workers. They are more economic in nature, like workers demanding an end to unfair labor practices. They're, demanding that their right to free speech be recognized. They're demanding fair wages. They're demanding economic security as well as retirement and benefit security. However, something that has been even more positive than that has been the fact that the union is demanding, an end to employer-controlled pension going towards foreign companies and foreign investment. They're demanding an end to, Kaiser having connections to ICE detention centers and also their investments being made into predatory lending. Some union members have even stated more explicitly on the line in recent weeks that the reasons for striking aren't purely economic, but these more political demands as well, which is definitely a sign of things moving forward. And on the other hand, I think, another thing that we've seen coming up is that the local public school teachers union, UESF, is moving towards a strike in February. So if this does end up happening, it'll be the first time in half a century that the teachers union has gone on strike. So recently, 5,200 teachers voted to a tune of 97.6% to strike. Some of their demands include stuff like a fully funded dependent health care, wages increases, and as well as contract, language affirming SFUHC's commitments for immigrants and to ensure that it's a sanctuary city. So earlier this week, it was reported that the district hadn't indicated plans to meet the requirements. They've said some stuff about like, oh, we'll give you like a 6% increase, and yeah, we'll recognize like we're going to give you these benefits. But a lot of this stuff isn't writing, and a lot of these union members are saying it's not enough. And definitely, if the teachers strike, this will definitely be pretty positive development. I think we've seen within the past half decade to a decade a lot of different nurses striking. But not this type of, educators striking, at least in like public schools. And in our lifetime, really. So, yeah, I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts about this stuff.
Well, I mean, the San Francisco Teachers Union hasn't struck for almost 50 years because they're rich. They're
Hmm.
pretty like teachers are all secretly rich. The administrators are all secretly rich. Like it's just like what I mean when I say that is that there's just like there's a particular class relationship there, right? In terms of the certificate staff, the non-certificate staff, right? Folks who are represented by the educators union versus the other labor organizations that are active within the school district, right? And so I think it's really kind of indicative is just like how the conditions in our society are getting so intense that even sections of the population that are at work are quite comfortable actually, even them are inclined to take a stand, right? And so we kind of just see how this extending sort of slump in the economy and like this growing disgust at the status quo is pushing whole sections of people that normally wouldn't take action, have taken action. I was with the district for over 3 years as of last year. And then they had budget cuts last year, and I got laid off. I could go on about different things going on in the district. But we had a couple different strike votes the last 3 years that never were able to meet that particular threshold. So I think it just shows this escalating contradiction going on in all of society. Actually, it's just like a slight microcosm.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think like it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over time. Like, I mean, I think it's definitely a positive development that the local teachers union is looking to strike. But it's also just a question of like what the union leadership is going to do over time. I think the thing that always frustrates a lot of people that I know that are union members is the fact that union leadership has a tendency to capitulate on these matters. And that's the thing that I think is like really stifled the labor movement time and time again. And so it's like, it's not, we don't see a large rank and file, working class centered labor movement in the United States. We see a very top down bureaucratic labor movement where people go on these semi symbolic 1 day, 2 day strikes. And then the leadership is like, well, this is as good as it's going to get. So deal with it. And that really frustrates a lot of people, and
Yeah.
that creates this downward spiral where people start to lose trust in their unions. They wonder if it's even worth it. That leads to declining union membership. That leads to less people trying to organize within the union. But I do think there have been some movement within the past few years of more rank and file members being like, well, screw you guys. Like, we need to actually do more. And it's going to take time and efforts and sacrifices for people to be able to do this. But I do think it is, it is a positive sign that things are moving in that direction. But yeah, it's a lot of work. That's for sure.
Well, I think the key thing in this is that the issue is obviously with the bosses, is with the capitalists, but also with the union leadership. So then, is there
Yeah.
like efforts for workers to move outside of that? Because the way it
hmm
works with teachers is like this. So like, there's anger at the contract for not paying for enough things. There might be some concessions. The rank and file wants to go further. Union
hmm
leadership stops because that's considered to be unreasonable. Then they win the contract negotiations. They bully people to accept the tentative agreement. And then the following year after that, the district institutes budget cuts. Union leadership says, well, since we got more money in the tentative agreement, we can't fight budget cuts. And then that used to undercut further activism. So
hmm
see how like they work hand in hand to actually fuck over everybody at the end of the day. Like some of the
Yeah.
certificate staff get like slight wage increases, but then they like use that as a justification to cut classes and shut down schools, create
Yeah.
more charter schools, and then ultimately lower enrollment, cut more teachers.
Yeah, no, I think that's like, very typical of what we've seen in a lot of different instances. The union leadership working hand in hand with the bosses in these
Yeah.
instances. Whether it is the state or whether it's the head of these different corporations. And they develop these tactics through a number of years. I mean, I remember reading about last year how I believe it was like the late 60s, early 70s, like how with like the auto workers in Detroit, how the union leadership specifically was working with these corporations and being like, hey, like if you take the union dues out of their paycheck, it'll be easier for us to leverage that over the workers, and so they'd be less likely to take more drastic, more meaningful action, and that's just something a lot of people take for granted nowadays. It's like, wait, like it didn't always used to be that way. It's like, yeah, it didn't always used to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a small example. But this is, these types of tactics are things that have developed for such a long time that a lot of people take for granted the fact that like the collaboration between these different between union leadership and these different bosses, heads of companies, is just a thing that happens, and it's a thing that we see even coming up when in certain situations where folks try to take over, and they're like, okay, we don't like the old leadership, so let's get our own people in, and then they end up acting in a very similar way, if not exactly the same. Sometimes even worse because they have less experience and they don't know what they're able to actually do. But ultimately, largely due to the fact that that's the only organization they're really a part of. It's just a union. It's nothing outside of that that's really trying to push for something greater, I feel like.